Welcome so far. A lot of participants joining now. Guess we wait until at least but we will start pretty much in time. So we have a very tight program to follow up, and I think the first 2 minutes, maybe the most of you had already heard about the rules, general chat rules and the chat and how the questions can be placed, or you can ask Andrew the questions. So I guess, Andrew, if it's fine for you, we just start with a meeting, with the session. So welcome everyone already on the session. Actually, my name is Stefan Weishaupt. I'm representative in Germany, but that's actually not the most important part of this session. It's actually that you hear a lot about the new realities of assessment with social distancing. Andrew also, as the most of the others, asked you to ask questions within the chat. He will be happy to answer as most of them as possible at the end. But feel free also to contact us in case we can't answer every question. I hope you will enjoy. And Andrew, I think you can start introducing yourself. It's easier than I can do, I guess. So
fantastic.
A great time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm Andrew Kahn. I'm the Senior Market Development Manager for English Assessment at Pearson. And it's a wonderful opportunity, hopefully, to talk a little bit about a subject that's very close to my heart, which is how you actually assess people under the current unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in and have found ourselves in over the course of the last year. So some of the themes we'll be looking at, see if I can just move on to the next page. Why even test? Why is testing still important? Talking a little bit about the shift to online assessment, particularly with a focus on testing at home, which is the only way a lot of people can test at the moment. How that relates to some kind of key issues around logistics, but also ethics. So things like privacy. How does that relate to what we're doing with online testing? And some kind of test tips, best practice, guidance, suggestions for educators, either educators who are using online assessment, might be preparing learners for online assessment, or maybe even in the future be taking tests themselves. So quite a lot to cover, and I'll rattle through it quickly because I want to make sure we've got some time for questions, as Stefan mentioned at the end. But first, what I'm going to do is to take you back to the summer of 2020. So we had a particular situation in the UK where we have learners who take state exams in history, maths, geography, whatever else it might be, called A-levels. And they do those for a very particular reason. Very often it's to get into university. So the grade you get in your A-level determines whether you go to university, which university you can go to. Do you go to your first choice, your second choice, your fifth choice, all these sorts of things. So very, very high stakes, very high pressure. There are also what we call linear qualifications. And what we mean by that is the assessment portion, the grading portion, is really concentrated at the end of that 2-year course. So you have very little assessment or no assessment for the duration of that course until the very end, then you have lots of exams. The problem we had in the UK is that those exams got cancelled. The schools couldn't open, all the exams were cancelled. You had a situation where learners were leaving school, leaving the end of high school at 17 or 18, needed grades. They could not get those grades through the normal mechanisms that they would with their exams. What the government decided to do was let teachers decide the grades that those learners likely would have received. That's a very subjective thing. One teacher may grade in a very generous way, one might be very rigorous. And it's not entirely fair. It could be unfair to an individual student. It could also vary a lot by school to school. So what they did is they introduced an algorithm to adjust those grades based on past performance, both the past performance of the school and the past performance of the learners. And you may be familiar with what happened next. It did not go down very well with parents, teachers, or students. It was a scandal. The newspapers are talking about chaos, anger, all sorts of things happening. Ultimately, the algorithm was ditched and they went back to pure teacher grading. So it's not directly relevant to what we do with English language assessment, but some of those key themes really do kind of feature for us as well. So one of the main ones is the perception of fairness. You may have worked out a system that you feel is absolutely as fair as it can possibly be. If you cannot communicate why that system is fair and people do not understand why that system is fair, they can get very passionate about it. Another one is the risk inherent to having all of your exams backloaded at the end of your course. If those exams are disrupted, you're left without a lot to work with in terms of information or data. And the other one is that it's really tough to create an alternative to those big state exams. It's not something you could do easily, so there may not be a perfect solution. What I'd say at this stage is with the English language side, both with Pearson English International Certificate, which used to be known as PT General, and PT Academic, we've still continued to test as far as possible as normal. So you might have fewer people, for example, in the PT Academic Test Centre, spaced out a little bit more, everything disinfected between sessions, but testing is continued for the most part. That's not necessarily always possible for every country, every situation, and every learner. So we've had to look at alternatives as well. So as we're looking at assessment through a digital lens today, I thought it would be interesting to see what people were talking about on Twitter when this situation occurred in the UK, some of the questions that they were asking. So here are two kind of representative ones. An open book, home-administered, multiple choice quiz would almost certainly have been more accurate than some algorithm, right? Somebody else saying, why not use the coursework and quickly create a unified short version of the A-level exam online with time limits? So if anybody is using an open book, they'll lose time. That would create a level playing field. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that when it comes to assessments. Looking at the test development side of assessments, with our international certificate test, it takes about 9 months to create a new test paper. And that's with a very stable test. We're currently in the process of developing a computer-based version of that test. And it's not as simple as putting that paper-based version on a screen. You have to work with how people engage with computers, how that changes from traditional assessments. And that's actually taken a good couple of years to get to a point where we can launch in the summer. So there's certainly when it comes to developing those tests, there's a balance between speed and fairness and accuracy. You can do something quickly, but whether that's a valid assessment tool is really open to question. And I would say in the vast majority of cases, trying to do something like an A-level test in a very short space of time in a different format is an extremely difficult thing to try and accomplish. There's also significant limits to what you can actually do with multiple choice questions. The advantage that multiple choice questions have is that they can be relatively easy for a computer to mark. The disadvantage is unless you've got really sophisticated technology, there's only so much you can actually find out from a multiple choice question. If you imagine a humanities test, we might have essay questions, trying to replicate what you're doing, trying to find out the same information, the same depth of knowledge with a multiple choice quiz is really difficult to do. I would say impossible when it comes to English. I know that some organizations do use multiple choice questions extensively in their English tests. At Pearson, we don't, because we feel you need to have the productive element of English as well. And multiple choice really limits what you can do, particularly on the productive side of English. People talk about a level playing field when it came to assessment online. Unfortunately, that's not really the case either. So the technology that people have access to is different. That people's level of comfort with technology is different as well. It's a really interesting question. But I live probably 30 miles outside of London. If my neighbour's watching Netflix, my internet connection gets a lot worse. And that's, in a very well-developed, well-built-up place. There's lots of students around the UK who don't have access to computers or don't have access to the internet in a reliable way. Anything you put in place that has technology needs to have a low barrier to entry. The other thing, of course, is both of those people said open book tests. The assumption is if you're doing a test in an unmonitored environment, you're probably going to be looking things up on Google. You're probably going to have your books open. That's one thing you can try and plan around. The other big risk is that they could get their parents to take the test. They could get their cousin who took the test 2 years ago to take the test for them. How do you stop that? One of the ways you can stop that is by using some kind of video monitoring service. So you can see the person when they're taking the test, make sure they're taking the test in the right way, making sure they are who they say they are. And that, I think, leads us down the road of remote monitoring, remote proctoring. People use these terms in different ways. Sometimes they use them interchangeably. To me, the best way to make sense of it is proctoring is where you've got somebody looking at you take a test in real time. Monitoring is where you might be using AI or video recording to see something happening after the test has taken place usually. Easy to have a remote proctoring service that's direct to learner. So instead of having the institution, university being the final decision maker when it comes to the validity of the test, you can have something where the exam board will actually say this is a legitimate test attempt. You can get a certificate that way. The advantages of the remote monitoring service is it's expensive. It's more flexible as well because you're not booking anybody's time when you're taking that test. What you're doing ultimately is using a service that can be accessed potentially 24 hours a day. It gives a lot more flexibility, but really does work a lot better with the institutional model of assessment. So the institutional model, as I say, is where the institution, typically a university, will have access to evidence of how that test was taken, and they, rather than the exam board, will be the ones that make that final determination of whether that's a valid test. Now, there's no right or wrong way. I think these are both legitimate ways of assessing people. They're both systems that Pearson uses extensively ourselves. It really just depends on what you're aiming to do, the best fit for the service you're aiming to provide. So you've got your way of testing, you've got your way of monitoring who's taking that test. Surely that solves all the problems. And unfortunately, not really that simple. So particularly in the US, there's been a real backlash against the idea of remote proctoring or remote monitoring, typically over the grounds of essentially the stress level involved in taking those tests, but also privacy issues as well. So I've seen teachers online saying they would prefer their students cheat on a test than have to go through the process of online testing. Which is tough to say, certainly in an English language situation. If you're taking a test which measures your English proficiency level and you're subverting that test, you're cheating on that test, you're going to be potentially put into a situation further down the line, whether it's at university, whether it's in a job, where you don't have the level of English that you require to function. That's going to be a much more stressful situation. But it does really mean that we need to look at the balance. We need to look at the sensitivity involved in taking these tests and really plan around that as far as possible. If you want a great example of what not to do, this is certainly one of them. So this is something that was shared 106,000 times on Twitter. It's an administrator from a US university communicating with students who are taking tests. And they say, all but one student violated a major testing protocol. Everyone except one student resized their browser, which means that you went to another website. If that happens again, you'll get a 0 on the next assignment. You have to have a well-lit room. You cannot take the test in the dark. Sit up. If I can only see your eyes, and that's a violation of testing protocol. No head for both males and females. Loss of head and eye movement for a short time period. A student in 6 minutes had 776 head movements. That's an indication of eyes moving away from the screen. I'd hate to have to write online cheating, which gets filed in the dean's office. Again, what you're looking for is balance. People need to know that they're in a testing situation. It's a formal testing situation. They are being monitored. They do need to take it seriously. But if you're a student and you're counting the number of times your eyes are moving in your head when you're taking a test, then you're going to be performing well below your potential. That means the more stress you're piling onto these students, the less accurate your assessments are going to be. Something to bear in mind. Another thing is the privacy element as well. So I think very often we're kind of used now to the idea of video conferences, video meetings, but people still very often don't like having their cameras on when they're chatting to people. And it's the same with people taking tests. Sometimes people are a little bit skeptical about that, saying, what could you learn about somebody just from the background of their presentation, whatever they're doing? Let's look at this suspicious character here. So you can see this person's background. They have art on the walls, art. They've got a keyboard, so maybe they're interested in music. They've got history books with very distinctive penguin history orange covers. So again, probably interested in history. You can see out of the window, there's the roof of another house. So either they probably on the top floor of an apartment building or they live in a self-contained house. If you're really eagle-eyed, you might see little paint samples on the shelves in the background. Now, in the UK, at least, it's very unusual for people to paint the interiors of their homes if they don't own those homes. So probably somebody who's not renting and owns their house. Now, that could all be completely wrong. You could have just created a completely false narrative about somebody from that background. It could be somebody else's house that they're taking a test in. It shows that there's actually quite a lot you can potentially learn about somebody. And there may be very good reasons for people to want to protect the privacy that they have in their environment. So I think that's particularly true when it comes to online tests, but also when it comes to the idea, if you're not using the kind of automated computer scoring that Pearson does, when it comes to things like subjectivity and bias, when it, in interview situations, if you're interviewing somebody in English, are you being influenced by their background, not just the level of English they're providing? So kind of interesting ideas there, and it's just something, again, to bear in mind. I'm going to look a little bit about the remote monitoring service we have with the Versant English Placement Test. I won't go into too much detail about the test itself. We can follow up offline about that. Ultimately, it's designed to be a computer-based test. It's 4 skills. It measures reading, writing, speaking, listening. A1 to C2 on the CEFR, takes less than an hour, uses the automated scoring system, so it takes less than 10 minutes for results to come back. Used quite often for placement purposes, but it's not just used for placement. Ultimately, it's a test you can use for all sorts of different reasons, designed also to be an institutional test. So something that we'd work with universities on. It's not something we would market and sell directly to learners. So with that in mind, it's important to know not designed to be a competitor or a direct alternative to the International Certificate or PT Academic. It's a different kind of test, but where those formal tests might be challenging for some reason to implement, either because of scale, cost, access to test centres, all sorts of things, you do have some universities around the world using Versant as a way to measure, do people have the level of English they require to go on to their course? And normally that's done in an environment where you can monitor them in real time, on site, within the university. Obviously, over the last year or so, it's not been possible to do that in a majority of cases. So you introduced a remote monitoring service alongside that. We partnered with a company called HirePro, which is very experienced in this. Essentially what happens is they've got an AI system, artificial intelligence, that checks on how that learner is taking the test and raises a red flag if anything is suspicious. So you've got somebody else on screen, for example, in some of these cases. You've got the learner completely disappearing from the screen. That's a situation that will get flagged to the administrator at the university, and they would at least have to have an explanation from the student as to why that happened. It may be an innocent explanation. Perhaps it's one of their parents walking to the kitchen behind them, but at least you need to know what's happened in that situation. You can also upload a photograph of the learner before the test. The AI system will match their face to the person that's actually taking the test. You can see in this situation, very low percentage match, clearly not the same person, gets flagged as suspicious. You also have a device proctoring service where you can see how many times that person's navigated away from the screen. So the Versant side of things is the institutional test. We are also introducing in the summer an online version of our Pearson English International Certificate, used to be known as PT General. That's going to have live proctoring through the OnView platform. So you can have somebody watching that person and engaging with them in real time. And that's going to be a direct-to-learner solution with a formal certificate. So we can have a direct-to-learner option as well as that maybe a little bit less formal Versant option for institutions as well. You may be thinking with the Versant test design, the Versant solution rather, what happens if the learner has an iPad? How do I know that they're not cheating or looking things up? I think one of the really key things is that I think this is a lesson for also people if they're designing their own tests within universities. There are limits on what you can control and you can plan around that. We always say that security starts with test design. So to give an example, I took a test a couple of years ago, online English test, where I was doing a gap fill exercise, kind of a standard exercise I think people would be very familiar with. But something about the writing style struck me as a little bit familiar, and I Googled it afterwards. What they'd done is taken a passage from Wikipedia and put that into their test. So if I'd been an unscrupulous student and just Googled some keywords, I'd have been able to find the Wikipedia page and copy directly across from that to the gap fill exercise. You also really need to take care with item types when you're designing tests. There's another test available at the moment, not a Pearson test. We are asked to select which English words are real English words and which are fake English words, which, I mean, all sorts of pedagogical questions as to whether that's a valid way of assessing. But it's also something you can Google in 2 seconds. You can kind of work that out really easily. So with the Versant approach, we've got randomized test forms, strict question level time limits, but also a really strong focus on integrated skills and productive English. So I can pretty much guarantee if somebody's sitting there with an iPad just out of shot, they're going to do worse on the test than if they just try to engage with it properly. Some other kind of best practice tips. Be aware of the GDPR compliance issues. So with our Versant solution, everything is hosted in terms of the servers for the video monitoring in Ireland, fully GDPR compliant, but make people aware of what you're using that information for. The other key thing to remember, particularly when it comes to the legal side of things, is age limits on testing with video. So with the Higher Pro solution with Versant, we're saying only take this test if you're 18 years old and over. With the international certificate that's coming in the summer, it's not going to have that hard age limit, but you are going to require parental permission to take the test below a certain age. Be aware of that if you're looking to implement tests online yourself. Tips for candidates: basic, simple tests, prep things. Get familiar with the test content in advance or test format in advance. Try and relax as far as possible. Make sure your background is free of anything you don't want people to see. Make sure your video, your audio work, make sure your lighting is good. But one thing that people very often forget, and I forget myself, is comfort. So if you're thinking about a situation, particularly with a long test, where, if you're moving around, if you're trying to get comfortable, potentially you could get flagged by a system thinking you're doing something incorrect, thinking that you're trying to look away from the screen or cheat or something. Just try and make sure you're comfortable in advance. Make sure you've got a cushion, a pillow, whatever it is, so you're not fidgeting and moving around a lot. Educators, I think one of the key things, as we've discussed, is being sensitive to the people's situations. Nobody is operating in the optimum situation at the moment. So I've got cats scratching at my door at the moment. So, we're all in a situation where we're getting distracted. We're, in a challenging position. And we don't need additional stress. So try and be as sensitive as possible when it comes to setting exams. And be clear with instructions as well. That's really important. You don't need additional stress trying to work out how to access the test or where I go, what website do I use, how do I enter my code, all those sorts of things. Clarity with instructions helps a lot. If you have the opportunity to use assessment tools, where if there is any gray area, if there's any doubt as to whether the learner's doing something incorrect or not, you can retest them using a different test form or a randomized test form. That's better than just saying, I'm sorry, don't accept the test, goodbye. Bring it back to where we started, and we talked a lot about those schools without a lot of assessment throughout the year for those A-level students. One thing you can also do with the English side of things is have this idea of benchmark testing. So a test that you can take at the start of the year, at the middle of the year, potentially at the end of the year as well. And that might not be an direct alternative to your formal certificated tests, but it gives you something to go on. It gives you some diagnostic information. It gives you some data. And if a learner comes to you or the parents come to you at the end of the year and say, well, what do you think I would have scored in my English test? Do you think I'm at a B2 or a B1? You've got some data that you can use to make a judgment on that if they can't have that formal test at the end. So if you have the opportunity to catch Eleonora Pacina and Mike Mayer's presentation on benchmark on the global scale of English today, absolutely try and check that out, because I think it'd be really interesting. It links very much into what we're doing in terms of the alternatives or complements to those big formal end of year tests. So that's kind of where I would wrap up. I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that people might have. I don't know, Stefan, are there questions in the chat?
Yes, there are.
Fantastic. Okay.
So actually, as I'm from Germany, I would also ask a great question about GDPR and about privacy. So as this is definitely something not fit to all countries, is there anything what we could provide that fits, that really is an overview giving something about GDPR on a website, or are your thoughts about to that issue?
No, it's a really good question. I think we do have some information that we can share, but I think the key thing with GDPR is, firstly, it's where that data is held and stored. So we're making sure it's within the EU, making sure the protections fit EU law as far as possible, and that's what we have with the Higher Pro solution with the video recording, the servers in the EU. The other thing is being very, very clear with learners and with educators what purposes that data is going to be used for and where that data is going to be held. So one of the ways that we work with GDPR is that clarity when it comes to assessment, making sure that when a learner is taking a test, they're given information on what that data is being used for, making sure that when you're buying that test, you're making that order, on the order form, it has the kind of the legal terms and conditions. You can look at that and you can be comfortable with that before making that purchase. And I think those are the really two key things. It's just being as clear as possible as to what you're using it for, but also on the other side, use it for anything you wouldn't expect to be using it for. The only reason we have data for the video recordings for the Versant test is so educators can go in and they can see the tests as they were performed. I think the other key thing from the institutional side is make sure you only have a very limited number of people who can access those recordings. So if you have one or two administrators, keep it to one or two administrators who need to do that. Don't just make it an open password where anybody can go in and look at people's video recordings. Just kind of common sense approaches like that really do help.
Great. One question I think that's something that's very urgent for this person. She pasted it a few times. How would you say that this AI-based form of proctoring solves any of the issues that you indicated previously, privacy issues pertaining to background, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it's something to bear in mind when you are dealing with those tests. So again, it comes down to clarity. Take as much out from the background as possible when you're taking that test. The AI system is really designed to flag if anything is potentially untoward happening. So, I mean, again, it's not really designed to solve the problems, but it's just something to bear in mind when you're implementing a testing solution like that. One of the things I guess it does help to some extent is that the majority of cases, test takers take a test. If nothing unusual is happening, then that doesn't necessarily get flagged. You don't necessarily, as an institution, need to go in and see what happened with that test taker, because you know that test taker is basically doing things in the way that they were supposed to be doing. So it's really only into creating a situation where somebody might need to look at the video if there is something that is potentially a little bit suspicious or a grey area that needs to be investigated, rather than something like an online interview-based version of an English test, where there is always going to be that engagement with somebody who can see you, see your background. But again, I think it just comes down as far as possible to best practice, rather than it being a solution to the problem itself.
Great. Another thing about, I think yeah, there are a few questions about cheating in general. I think this is always on topic, cheating. And I think, to be fair, also with teachers, cheating is a possibility to say it that way. But there's a lot about new technology. For example, one was mentioning how can you make sure that someone is not having ear phones, one is with a different information than the other, and how can you monitor that? Is that possible at all, to be honest, Andrew? Is that possible?
No, it's a really good question. I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. So if you're using the remote proctoring service, so those more formal exams, you can go through the process where you have to take off your headphones, show them to the person in front of the camera, show your 360-degree environment, make sure nobody else can see the screen, all those sorts of things. So you can go through processes to secure some, physical security of the test. But if you're using that, I think, remote monitoring service a little bit more flexible in terms of the requirements, again, I would say one of the key points for me is there are limits to what you can do. So try and build security into the test design. Just to give you a basic example with a Versant test, let's say one of the items in the Versant test is read aloud, so reading a passage in English. Now, somebody could be looking through Google Glasses or something, reading that out. They could be talking into somebody's ear when they're taking the test, telling them what to say. The difference between being able to do that, but actually replicate the speech you're supposed to, is huge. It's not easy to take a test under very severe time pressure where somebody's giving advice or guidance in the background. Just the way that we've designed those tests means you have to have very quick responses, very natural responses, but responses that really do relate to that person's innate level of English. If I can't speak fluently, nobody talking in my ear is going to make me speak fluently. Even if they're telling me exactly what I should be saying, there's a difference between that and being able to replicate that. So again, it comes down to test design in a large part.
Cool. Final question is yes or no. Do you think, would you agree with, I would say this is an option of testing, but do you also think it is the future, so that it will be remote proctoring only, or is that something that would be
it's a really interesting question. I would always say that this is going to be an option, and it's going to be an increasingly important option. So as you go forward, I would expect more of those formal exams, like international certificate as an example, to have that as an option for people. But there's a lot of people out there who don't necessarily want to take a test in their own home if they can avoid it, who would feel more comfortable in a test center, feel more comfortable in an environment where they've got somebody, an administrator in front of them they can speak to. There's the other factor is you can have some issues, in terms of background noise. Not everybody lives in the optimum environment to take a test. So there'll always be people who want to have that option of going in, quiet environment, spaced out desks, somebody keeping an eye on them when they're taking the test. They can ask questions, see if anything goes wrong. To me, it's going to be an option, a very important option, but only an option.
I think that's a great final word. I think it's a controversial discussion and will always be, is trust in AI, trust in remote everything. Yeah. But as we have seen, we need to trust it from day to day on now a little bit more. So thanks for listening. It's okay if I paste your email address in the chat?
Oh, please do.
For questions, please do. Don't hesitate to contact Andrew or also your representative in your region. Thanks a lot, and yeah, looking forward to your questions. And Andrew, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining. Take care.